I don't know where to start, so I'll just lay it out there. My name's Danny, 36 years old, and I work at a car parts factory. The hours are long, the pay is enough to keep the lights on, and the work is honest. I've been married to Marcy for 8 years now. We've got 2 kids, a boy and a girl, who mean everything to me. I thought I was living a simple but good life. Turns out, I was just walking blindfolded into a nightmare. Last Thursday, I was supposed to work a double shift. Equipment failure cut the day short. And for once, I was actually excited to surprise Marcy. Usually, when I get home, she's got dinner ready, and the kids are either doing homework or arguing over the TV. I stopped by the gas station, grabbed her favorite iced coffee, and even picked up some gummy worms for the kids. I remember humming along to some awful country song on the radio. I felt good, content, even. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. There was a sleek black Audi parked out front. At first, I thought maybe it was one of Marcy's friends or someone from her yoga group. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The car was too flashy, too polished. Not the kind of thing you'd expect in our driveway. I stepped inside quietly. The kids were at school, so the house was silent except for faint voices coming from upstairs. I felt my stomach drop. The iced coffee started sweating in my hand as I climbed the stairs. My feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. And then I heard it, Marcy's laugh, followed by a man's voice. I don't even know how I pushed the door open, but I did. And there she was, Marcy, my wife, tangled up in our bed with some guy. He was older, maybe early 40s, muscular, with salt and pepper hair. They both froze, wide-eyed, staring at me like I was the intruder. The iced coffee slipped from my hand and hit the floor, splattering everywhere. Marcy didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't even look ashamed. Instead, she rolled her eyes and said, "Well, I guess the factory let you off early today." Tony, that's his name, sat up in bed like he owned the place. He didn't flinch, didn't cover himself, just stared me down like I was some pathetic joke. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Everything in me felt like it was crumbling into pieces. Marcy stood up, wrapped herself in the sheet, and said something that'll stick with me forever. "Honestly, Danny, what did you expect? Look at him, and look at you." The man, Tony, smirked. I wanted to hit him, scream, do something. But I just stood there like an idiot while my world fell apart. And that was just the beginning. I don't know how long I stood there in that doorway. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt frozen, and my body wouldn't move. Marcy stood there, holding that sheet against her chest like it gave her some moral high ground. Tony, this smug, square-jawed guy, just smirked at me like he knew he had already won. "Danny, close your mouth. You look pathetic," Marcy said flatly, like I had just interrupted her morning coffee instead of catching her in our bed with another man. That broke something in me. My voice cracked as I finally managed to stammer. "How long, Marcy? How long has this been going on?" She sighed, like I was some whiny kid pestering her with too many questions. 6 months, Danny. Half a year. And before you start, no, I'm not sorry. Tony raised an eyebrow at her, like he was impressed with her boldness. I pointed at him, my finger trembling with rage. You get out of my house. Now." But Marcy stepped between us, her voice sharp. "No, Danny. He's not leaving. And if you try to make him, he'll drop you right here in your own home." I looked at Tony, who was already pulling on his crisp white button-down shirt, his smirk unwavering. He was built like a linebacker, and I hated that I felt intimidated in my own bedroom. "You've got some nerve, man," I muttered. Tony chuckled, shaking his head. "Look, buddy, this isn't personal. Marcy just needed a real man in her life." Marcy smirked and crossed her arms. "See, Danny, Tony knows how to take care of me. He knows how to satisfy me." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Every word was a dagger, twisting deeper. But then Marcy kept going. her voice rising with every word. "You think your long hours at the factory make you some kind of hero? You come home smelling like grease and sweat, expecting me to still be excited to see you? Tony takes me to nice places. He buys me gifts. He doesn't come home exhausted and complaining about overtime." I stared at her, barely recognizing the woman in front of me. This wasn't the Marcy I had married. This wasn't the mother of my children. "Do the kids know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She rolled her eyes. "Of course not, Danny. I'm not an idiot, but they'll know soon enough if you try to pull any stunts. You want to tell your family, your co-workers, your little drinking buddies? Go ahead. I'll make sure everyone knows you were a bad husband, that you pushed me into Tony's arms." Tony let out a low whistle. "Marcy, babe, let's not get too mean. He's already broken enough." I wanted to punch him. I wanted to throw him out the window. But Marcy stood there, like some twisted bodyguard, daring me to try. "Go downstairs, Danny," she said coldly. "I've moved your stuff into the guest room. That's your space now. We'll figure out the logistics later, but you're not kicking me out, and you're not kicking Tony out either." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't even pretending to be remorseful. She was laying out the terms of my humiliation like it was a business deal. "Marcy, we have kids. What about them?" She smirked again. "You'll still be their dad, Danny. But let's face it, you're more useful as a babysitter while I'm with Tony. And before you start thinking you'll fight for custody or make a big scene, let me remind you, Tony's wealthy. He's got connections. You'd lose, Danny. You'd lose everything." That was the final blow. I turned and stumbled out of the room. My head was spinning, my vision blurred. I could hear Tony laughing softly behind me, and Marcy saying something under her breath. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized I was still holding that stupid iced coffee in my hand. It had leaked everywhere, the cup crumpled in my grip. I felt hollow. I felt weak. And worst of all, I felt trapped. I sat down on the couch in the living room, staring at nothing. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear them moving around. Tony probably getting dressed, Marcy probably fixing her hair. I had walked into my own home thinking I'd surprise my wife with coffee. Instead, I had walked into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And it was only getting started. I sat on the couch, clutching my head, trying to make sense of everything. Upstairs, I could hear Marcy laughing softly, probably at something Tony said. My stomach churned. After a while, Marcy came down, fully dressed, her makeup fresh like nothing had happened. She tossed a set of sheets onto my lap. "The guest room's yours now, Danny. Make yourself comfortable." I looked up at her, searching her face for some flicker of guilt or regret. There was none. "And Tony?" I asked quietly. She shrugged. "He'll come and go as he pleases. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder? I felt like I was sinking into quicksand. I didn't respond. I just grabbed the sheets and walked to the guest room. It smelled stale, like the door hadn't been open in weeks. My clothes were piled on the bed, half folded, like an afterthought. I shut the door behind me and locked it. For hours, I just sat there, staring at the wall. My phone buzzed a few times. Text from work asking if everything was okay. I couldn't answer. At some point, I heard the front door close and Tony's car pull away. Marcy's voice floated faintly through the house as she hummed a song I used to love. I lay down on the lumpy mattress, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't my home anymore. It was theirs. When I finally pulled myself out of that stiff guest room bed, it was dark outside. The smell of dinner crept under the door, something with garlic. For a brief second, I thought about joining Marcy and the kids at the table, pretending like nothing happened. But then I remembered everything. I stepped into the hallway. The sound of laughter floated up from the dining room. Marcy's laugh, the kids' giggles. It was so normal, like nothing had cracked our world in half just hours ago. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. Then Marcy spotted me. Oh, look who finally decided to join us, she called out, her voice light, almost cheerful. Kids, say hi to Daddy. The kids turned, smiling, clueless about the weight pressing on my chest. Hi, Dad, they said in unison before diving back into their spaghetti. Marcy raised an eyebrow at me. You gonna join us or just stand there? I shook my head. I'm not hungry. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened. Suit yourself. I went back to the guest room and shut the door. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. My daughter's voice whispered through the wood. Daddy, are you okay? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Yeah, sweetheart. Daddy's just tired. She hesitated, then said softly, Okay, good night, Daddy. I waited until I heard her little footsteps fade away before I let the tears come. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight creeping through the tiny guest room window. My body ached, my head throbbed, and reality hit me like a truck all over again. I shuffled into the kitchen, hoping to grab some coffee before Marcy or the kids were up. But there she was, leaning against the counter in a silk robe, sipping her own cup like some queen on her throne. Morning, Danny, she said casually, like we were still some picture-perfect couple. I poured myself a cup, my hands shaking slightly. Marcy, we can't live like this. The kids. She cut me off with a sharp laugh. Oh, Danny, stop. The kids will be fine as long as you don't make a scene. I looked at her, trying to find some trace of the woman I married. Do you even hear yourself? You've destroyed everything. She set her mug down and walked up to me, her voice low and venomous. Listen carefully, Danny. If you try to tell anyone about this, if you try to turn the kids against me, or if you even think about making a move against Tony, I will ruin you. Marcy, come on. No. You'll lose the kids. You'll lose this house. And I'll make sure everyone thinks you're some bitter, unstable loser who couldn't keep his wife happy. Her face was inches from mine, her voice ice cold. You understand me? I nodded stiffly, my fists clenched at my sides. She smirked, stepping back. Good boy. Now, you'll take the kids to school today. I have plans. With that, she turned on her heel and walked back upstairs, leaving me standing in the kitchen, coffee in hand. Feeling smaller than I ever had in my life, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Marcy went upstairs. My coffee had gone cold, but I still sipped it, staring into the mug like it held answers. Eventually, I heard the kids coming down, backpacks bouncing against their little shoulders. My son, Jake, was talking about some science project, and my daughter, Ellie, was clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. Morning, Dad, Ellie chirped, her big eyes bright and innocent. Morning, sweetie, I said, forcing a smile. Marcy reappeared, dressed in a sleek black outfit, her hair perfectly styled. She kissed each kid on the forehead. Be good for Daddy today, okay? Mommy's got errands to run. Jake wrinkled his nose. Why can't you take us to school, Mom? She glanced at me briefly, her smile tight. Because Daddy's got it covered today, sweetheart. Now go on, your breakfast is in the car. The kids ran out the door. Marcy leaned against the frame, crossing her arms. Remember what I said, Danny. Play nice. I didn't reply. I just grabbed the car keys and walked out. The drive to school was quiet except for Ellie humming softly in the back seat. When we pulled up to the drop-off line, Jake hopped out first, already distracted by his friends. Ellie lingered, her small hand resting on my shoulder from the back seat. Daddy, are you sad? She asked softly. I turned around, my chest tightening. No, baby. Daddy's just tired. She nodded slowly, then leaned forward and hugged me as best as she could from her booster seat. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweetheart. Always. She hopped out, and I watched them disappear into the school building. For a brief moment, I thought about driving away, just hitting the gas and disappearing. But then I thought about Ellie's hug, Jake's goofy grin, and the way they both still looked at me with trust. I couldn't leave them. I drove home, back to the house where everything had fallen apart, and I knew Marcy would be waiting. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Every red light gave me too much time to think about Marcy, about Tony, about the wreckage of the life I thought I had built. The radio was playing some upbeat pop song, but it felt like mockery, so I turned it off. When I pulled into the driveway, Marcy's car was gone. I sat in my truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My home, our home, felt alien now. The windows, the front porch, even the stupid garden gnome by the mailbox all felt like props in someone else's life. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside. The silence hit me like a punch to the chest. The living room was spotless, the sun pouring through the curtains, but it felt sterile cold. There was no laughter, no sounds of little feet running across the floor, no smell of dinner simmering on the stove, just silence. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's when I saw it, a stack of my things piled on the counter, a duffel bag, some framed photos of me with the kids, and a few personal things Marcy had decided I was allowed to keep. There was also a note, written in her neat handwriting. Danny, take some time to think. Don't do anything stupid. The kids need stability, not drama. Marcy. My blood boiled as I crumpled the note in my hand and threw it across the room. Stability? She was talking about stability while she let some guy parade around our house like he owned the place. I grabbed the duffel bag and unzipped it. Inside were a few pairs of my jeans, a couple of shirts, and some of my work tools. The audacity of her packing my things like I was a guest in my own home made my stomach turn. I slammed the bag shut and stormed into the living room, dropping onto the couch. My mind raced with thoughts, anger, sadness, confusion, humiliation. But above all, there was this heavy, suffocating sense of powerlessness. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my buddy Mike at the factory. Mike, hey man, you good? You didn't show up today. Everything all right? I started typing out a reply but stopped halfway through. What was I supposed to say? Hey Mike, caught my wife cheating with a rich guy. She's blackmailing me. And now I'm living in the guest room like a dog. Hope your shift's going great. Instead, I just typed back, yeah, just sick. I'll be in tomorrow. I tossed my phone on the coffee table and buried my face in my hands. Time passed. I don't know how long before I heard Marcy's car pull into the driveway. My chest tightened as I heard the front door open and her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Danny, she called out, her voice almost sing-song. I stayed seated on the couch. She walked into the living room, her purse slung over her shoulder, shopping bags dangling from her arms. Spent the day treating yourself, I see, I said flatly. She set the bags down and sighed, like she was already exhausted by me. Danny, don't start. I told you this doesn't have to be ugly. I stood up, my voice low and sharp. You've turned our marriage into a circus, Marcy. You're sleeping with some guy in our bed, and you think this doesn't have to be ugly? She crossed her arms, her face hardening. Don't act like you're some perfect saint, Danny. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. Long hours at the factory, coming home tired, barely talking to me. What did you think was going to happen? I was working to provide for this family. I shouted, my voice cracking. And look where that got us. She snapped back. You want to play the victim, fine. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm the villain. Tony treats me well, Danny. He respects me. He makes me feel alive. And honestly, I deserve that. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. What about the kids, Marcy? Do they deserve this? Do they deserve to see their parents like this? She hesitated, just for a second, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, maybe guilt, maybe regret. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. They'll be fine, she said coldly. Kids are resilient. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. You keep saying that like it's a magic spell. They'll be fine, huh? When Jake asked me why I sleep in the guest room, When Ellie starts noticing Tony hanging around more often, you think they're stupid? Marcy didn't answer. She just picked up her shopping bags and started walking away. Where are you going? I asked. To take a bath, she said over her shoulder. I suggest you take a walk or something. Cool off. I watched her disappear up the stairs, her heels clicking like a countdown in my head. The rage inside me was boiling over, but more than anything, I felt hollow, like I was a ghost in my own home. I grabbed my coat from the rack by the door and stepped outside into the cold evening air. I needed space. I needed air. But most of all, I needed a plan. Because this wasn't sustainable. I don't remember how long I walked. The cold air bit at my face, and the sky had turned a dull orange before fading into night. My feet carried me aimlessly through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, past neatly trimmed lawns and houses glowing with warm light from family dinners. I felt like an outsider looking in, like I didn't belong here anymore. Eventually, I found myself at a park. The swings creaked in the wind, and the faint hum of passing cars filled the silence. I sat down on a worn-out bench, my breath clouding in front of me. How did it get to this? Marcy's words echoed in my head. You've been checked out for years, Danny. Was she right? Had I been too wrapped up in work, too exhausted to see our marriage falling apart? But no, that wasn't fair. I worked hard because I had to, because someone had to keep the bills paid, the kids fed, and the house running. I wasn't out drinking with buddies every night or blowing money on stupid toys. I was sacrificing for my family. And Marcy was spending afternoons tangled up with some guy named Tony in our bed. My stomach turned. Hey, Danny. I flinched at the sound of my name. Looking up, I saw Mike, my buddy from the factory, walking towards me, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. Mike, what are you doing here? Man, I was just grabbing some food down the street and saw you sitting here. You look rough, buddy. Everything okay? For a moment, I considered lying, saying something about work stress or needing fresh air. But the words wouldn't come. No, Mike, everything's not okay. He sat down beside me, the bench creaking under his weight. Talk to me, man. What's going on? So I told him. Not everything, but enough. Enough for him to understand why I looked like a guy who had been hit by a train. When I finished, Mike let out a low whistle. Man, Danny, I don't even know what to say. That's messed up. We sat in silence for a while. Mike pulled a pack of cigarettes from his jacket, offered me one, but I shook my head. What are you going to do? He asked finally. I shrugged. I don't know, Mike. I'm stuck. Marcy's got me cornered. If I try to fight her on this, she'll take the kids, the house, everything. And Tony, he's got money. Connections. I can't win. Mike nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Listen, Danny, you're a good guy. I know you. You're not the type to roll over and let someone walk all over you. But you've got to be smart about this. Smart how? I asked bitterly. Document everything. Texts, emails, anything shady she says. Write it down. Keep your head down. Don't lose your temper and start planning. If this goes to court, you'll need every bit of proof you can get. I nodded, his words sinking in. Mike wasn't wrong. I couldn't let my emotions drive me into a corner. I had to be methodical, calm, and focused. Thanks, Mike, I said, my voice quiet. He clapped me on the back. Anytime, man. And listen, if you ever need to crash at my place, you know the couch is always open. We sat there for a few more minutes before Mike stood up and walked away, leaving me alone on the bench again. His advice echoed in my head. Document everything. When I got back home, the lights were off in most of the house. Marcy was probably asleep, or pretending to be. I crept upstairs to the guest room and quietly shut the door behind me. I sat down at the small desk by the window, pulled out an old notebook, and started writing. I wrote down everything. The day I came home early what I saw, what Marcy said, how she threatened me, and every detail I could remember. When I finished, I had the notebook under the mattress and sat back in the creaky desk chair. Mike was right. I had to play this smart. I had to protect myself. And more importantly, I had to protect my kids the next morning. I woke up before dawn. My body felt heavy, but my mind was sharp, wired almost. Mike's words kept repeating in my head, document everything. Stay calm. Play it smart. Marcy was still asleep when I crept downstairs. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs where my kids usually sat, laughing over breakfast. I needed a plan. First, I grabbed an old USB drive from the junk drawer. Then I went into the home office. Marcy rarely used it. I opened the family computer and started digging. Emails, text backups, anything that might give me an edge. It didn't take long to find them. There were emails between Marcy and Tony, long ones. Some flirty, some downright explicit. They talked about meeting up during the day, about how they couldn't wait to see each other again, about me. Tony had written, "He won't do anything, Marcy. Guys like him just roll over. Don't worry about it." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, but I kept going. I copied every single email onto the USB drive. Then I found a folder labeled Finances. Inside were Marcy's bank statements, and that's when things got worse. There were transactions, fancy restaurants, hotel stays, jewelry. Thousands of dollars spent over the last 6 months, and all of it lined up with the timeline she had given me. My wife had been spending our money on him. I backed up those documents too. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to rise, and I heard footsteps upstairs. Marcy was awake. I quickly shut down the computer, tucked the USB into my pocket, and went back to the kitchen. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when she walked in. She was wearing one of those silky robes again, her hair pulled into a messy bun. "You're up early," she said, her voice flat. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning me. "You're not going to do anything stupid, are you, Danny's?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, I wondered if she had always been this cold or if something had changed in her over time. "No, Marcy, I'm not going to do anything stupid." She sipped her coffee, her eyes narrowing slightly like she didn't fully believe me. "Good. Because if you mess this up, Danny, it's not just you who loses. It's the kids, too." Her words felt like a slap, but I just nodded and turned away from her. The kids came down shortly after, bright-eyed and ready for school. I packed their lunches, made small talk, and forced myself to smile through it all. When I dropped them off, Ellie hugged me tight again, and Jake gave me a goofy thumbs up before running off with his friends. As I drove away, I felt this sharp, unyielding determination settle in my chest. I wasn't going to let Marcy take everything from me. I wasn't going to let Tony waltz into my house and act like he owned my life. I spent the rest of the day making copies of everything I had gathered, emails, bank statements, text backups. I uploaded them to a cloud drive and made another backup on a second USB drive. Then I had both USB drives in different places, one under the lining of my toolbox in the garage and the other in the air vent in the guest room. By the time Marcy got home that evening, I had everything locked down. She walked through the door, carrying shopping bags again, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor. "Busy day, Danny?" she asked casually as she passed me in the hallway. "Yeah," I said, my voice calm. "Very productive." She paused for a second, like she was trying to read me, then disappeared upstairs. I sat down on the couch, the weight of what I had done sinking in. This was just the beginning. Marcy thought she had me cornered, thought I was too weak to fight back. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to lose my kids. I wasn't going to lose my life. Not without a fight. Dinner that night was quiet. The kids chatted about school while Marcy scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging anyone. I sat there, nodding along to Jake's story about his science project, but my eyes kept flicking to Marcy. She was distracted, tense even. Her foot tapped under the table, and every few minutes, she'd glance at her phone screen and smirk before flipping it over. After the kids finished eating and ran off to the living room, I finally spoke. "Marcy, can we talk?" She sighed, setting her phone down with an exaggerated eye roll. "What now, Danny? I want to know what the endgame is here. Are you planning on leaving? Or am I supposed to just exist in the guest room while you parade Tony around like this is normal?" She smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, Danny, you still don't get it, do you? You're here because it's convenient. The kids need stability, and Tony doesn't want the hassle of full-time parenting." The way she said it, so casual, so dismissive, made my stomach turn. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marcy. You think Tony's going to stick around forever? Or that the kids won't notice what's happening?" For a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Doubt, maybe fear, but she masked it quickly with that same icy stare. "I don't need your advice, Danny. Just keep playing your role, and everything will be fine." She grabbed her phone and walked out of the dining room, leaving her half-empty wine glass behind. I stayed at the table for a long time after she left, staring at the glass, the way the light reflected off the deep red liquid. Her mask was cracking. I could feel it. She wasn't as in control as she wanted me to believe. The next day felt off from the start. Marcy was dressed up again. Tight skirt, blouse unbuttoned just enough to raise eyebrows. She had her phone glued to her hand and barely said 2 words to me before heading out the door. "Don't forget to pick up Ellie from dance class," she said over her shoulder before slamming the door shut. The house was silent again. I spent the morning pacing, my mind racing with everything I'd uncovered so far. The USB drives, the emails, the bank statements, it was all there, neatly hidden away. But what was I supposed to do with it? Around noon, there was a knock at the front door. I froze. No one ever came by unannounced. When I opened it, Tony stood there, slick, confident, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Danny," he said smoothly, like we were old pals. "What do you want?" I asked, gripping the edge of the door. He smirked. "Relax, man. I'm just here to talk. Mind if I come in?" "Yeah, actually I do mind." He ignored me and stepped inside anyway, walking past me like he owned the place. He strolled into the living room and looked around, his hands in his pockets. "Nice place. Marcy said you worked hard for it. Get to the point, Tony." He turned to face me, his smile fading into something colder. "Look, Danny, I get it. This situation isn't ideal for you, but Marcy's happy. And when Marcy's happy, everything runs smoother. You following me?" My fists clenched at my sides. "You've got some nerve coming into my house and talking to me like this." He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm giving you some free advice, Danny. Don't rock the boat. Keep your head down. Stay in your little guest room, and everyone gets what they want. You start making noise, talking to lawyers, trying to make this ugly, and you'll lose. Marcy's smart. She'll turn everyone against you." For a moment, I considered swinging at him, just one good punch to wipe that smirk off his face. But I didn't. Instead, I said quietly, "Get out of my house, Tony." He stared at me for a long moment, then chuckled under his breath. "Suit yourself, Danny. Just remember, I tried to be civil." With that, he walked out, leaving the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, my chest heaving. Tony had just made one thing very clear. They weren't afraid of me, but they should be that I stayed by the door for a long time after Tony left, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. His words replayed over and over in my head. "Don't rock the boat. You'll lose." But there was something else in his voice, something he didn't mean to let slip. Fear. He wasn't as confident as he wanted me to believe. Neither of them were. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and sat down at the table. My hands were still shaking, but my mind was clear for the first time in days. They were bluffing. Marcy's threats, Tony's smug warnings. It was all smoke and mirrors. They wanted me to believe I was powerless because the second I realized I wasn't, their little game would fall apart. I pulled out my phone and started searching for family lawyers nearby. I didn't know what I was doing, what the first step even was, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. After a few minutes, I found one, Jessica Hayes, family attorney. Her reviews were good, and her website made her seem sharp, no nonsense. I dialed the number. Jessica Hayes' office. How can I help you? Hi. My name's Danny. I need some legal advice about my marriage. The receptionist's voice softened. Of course, Danny. Ms. Hayes has an opening tomorrow morning at 10. Can you make it? Yeah, I can. After hanging up, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. It was just one step, one phone call, but it felt like I had taken back a tiny piece of control. I spent the rest of the day going through my notebook, adding details, making sure everything was clear and organized. The emails, the bank statements, the conversations. I reviewed it all again and again, making sure I hadn't missed anything. By the time the kids got home, I felt steady for the first time in days. Hey, Dad, Jake said, tossing his backpack on the floor. Hey, buddy, how was school? He launched into a story about some new kid in his class, and Ellie followed close behind, clutching a drawing she made in art class. Look, Daddy, it's a rainbow, she said proudly, holding up a crayon masterpiece. It's beautiful, sweetheart. I bent down and gave her a hug, holding on a little longer than usual. Marcy got home an hour later. She breezed through the door with a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other. Dinner ready, Danny? She asked, not even looking at me. It's on the stove, I said calmly. She paused, looking up briefly, her eyes narrowing. What's with the attitude? No attitude, Marcy, I replied, keeping my voice even. She lingered for a second, trying to read me, then shrugged and walked upstairs. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the guest room with my notebook and the USB drive spread out in front of me. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Jessica Hayes. Tomorrow, I'd start fighting back. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at school like usual. Ellie hugged me tighter than normal. Her little arms wrapped around my neck as if she could sense something was wrong. Bye, Daddy. Love you, she chirped as she ran toward the school doors. Love you too, sweetheart, I called back, my chest tightening. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel. Today felt heavier than the others, like the air itself was pressing down on me. But I had a plan now, a direction. Jessica Hayes' office was in a modest building on the edge of town. It wasn't one of those flashy law firms with marble floors and leather chairs. It felt straightforward, professional. When I walked in, a woman in her mid-40s greeted me. Sharp blue eyes, dark hair tied back in a bun, and an expression that made it clear she didn't waste time. Mr. Daniels, she said, standing up and extending her hand. Yes, ma'am, I said, shaking her hand firmly. Please have a seat. Let's get started. I sat across from her at a large wooden desk, clutching the USB drive and my notebook like they were life rafts. Tell me everything, Danny, she said, leaning back in her chair. And I did. I told her about walking in on Marcy and Tony, about the threats, the manipulation, the kids, and the way Marcy had shoved me into the guest room like I was some stray dog. I showed her the emails, the bank statements, and every word I had scribbled into my notebook. Jessica didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. She just listened, taking occasional notes and nodding at the right moments. When I finished, she let out a long breath and folded her hands on the desk. "Well, Danny, I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "This isn't going to be easy. Marcy's already built a narrative where you're the passive one, the caretaker, while she's off playing house with Tony. And if this goes to court, she'll lean into that hard." I swallowed, bracing myself. "But here's the good news," she continued. "You've done the right thing by documenting everything. These emails and financial records. There's strong evidence of her infidelity and misuse of marital assets. And that's not something the court looks kindly on. So, what do I do now?" I asked quietly. Jessica leaned forward. "You keep your head down. Don't lose your temper. Keep collecting evidence, texts, voicemails, anything. And don't tell Marcy or Tony about this meeting. The second they know you're taking legal action, they'll double down on trying to paint you as unstable." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Danny, this isn't just about winning a divorce case. It's about protecting your kids. And I promise you, I'll fight to make sure you don't lose them." Those words hit me hard. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Thank you, Jessica. Really." She handed me her card. "Call me if anything changes. And Danny, stay strong. You're not as trapped as they want you to believe." I left her office feeling lighter. Not good, not happy, but like I had a flashlight in the dark now. When I got home, Marcy was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand. She glanced up at me as I walked in. "You're out early," she said suspiciously. "Just needed some air," I replied calmly. She stared at me for a second, like she was trying to peel back my skin and see what I was hiding. But then she shrugged and went back to scrolling on her phone. I went to the guest room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. This was going to get ugly. I knew it, but for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was finally ready for the fight. The days after my meeting with Jessica felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with Marcy was a test. Her sharp glances, the way she hovered around me when I was on my phone, the constant suspicion in her voice. She knew something was different. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I was in the guest room scrolling through emails Jessica had sent me about next steps. Marcy knocked once before pushing the door open without waiting for me to answer. "Who've you been talking to, Danny?" she asked, arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "No one." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "You're hiding something. You've been different. Don't think I haven't noticed." I kept my face neutral, locking my phone and slipping it into my pocket. "Marcy, I'm tired. Can we not do this tonight?" She smirked. "Oh, poor Danny. Always tired. Always the victim." I stayed silent, staring at the floor. Her voice turned venomous. "You're not as smart as you think you are, Danny. You think you can outmaneuver me? You're pathetic." Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I looked up and met her gaze, my voice calm. "You're scared, Marcy." Her smirk twitched just slightly, and I knew I was right. "You can feel it, can't you?" I continued. "The ground shifting under your feet. You know you're losing control. Tony might have money and connections, but you've built this whole thing on lies. And sooner or later, it's going to collapse." Her face flushed with anger, but she had nothing to say. She turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I sat back on the bed, breathing hard. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the realization that, for once, I had rattled her. The next morning, she was cold but quiet. She barely spoke as she rushed the kids through breakfast and got them ready for school. Before leaving, she paused by the front door and looked at me. "You should think long and hard before you do something you can't undo, Danny." I didn't reply, and she walked out without another word. When the door clicked shut, I finally exhaled. I grabbed my phone and texted Jessica. "She's getting suspicious. Should I be worried?" A few minutes later, Jessica replied, "Stay calm. Stick to the plan. You're doing great. I spent the rest of the day going through more emails, updating my notebook, and scanning every corner of the house for anything else that could help me. Around noon, I noticed something odd. Marcy's laptop was still sitting on the kitchen counter. She never left it behind. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The screen lit up, and it wasn't password locked. Emails, texts, everything was right there. And what I found made my blood run cold. There were messages between Marcy and Tony, not just about their affair, but about me. "He's getting too quiet, Tony. I think he's up to something. Don't worry, babe. If he tries anything, we'll make sure he's the one who looks crazy. I've got people who can handle this." My heart slammed against my chest. People who can handle this. I copied everything onto another USB drive and uploaded it to the cloud. Marcy and Tony weren't just planning to keep me cornered. They were planning to destroy me if I made a move. I stared at the screen, my breathing uneven. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. This was war. The weight of those messages sat heavy in my chest. "If he tries anything, we'll make sure he's the one who looks crazy." Those words burned into my mind. I backed up everything from Marcy's laptop onto another USB drive and uploaded every file to the cloud. My hands were shaking, my stomach knotted, but my mind was clear. This wasn't just about custody or keeping the house anymore. I was fighting for my life. By the time Marcy came home that evening, I was already seated at the kitchen table, staring at the door. She walked in, wearing that same smug expression, but her eyes flicked to me with a spark of hesitation. "You're just sitting here? Creepy Danny." "Marcy," I said quietly, "we need to talk." She sighed and set her bag down. "Oh, God, what now? Are we doing this again?" I stood up, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. "I know everything, Marcy. Everything you and Tony have been planning." Her smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" I held up my phone. The messages, the emails, the plans to make me look unstable, to turn everyone against me. I have all of it. For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely rattled. Her arms crossed over her chest, her voice shaking slightly. You went through my stuff? Don't turn this on me," I said firmly. "You've been plotting to destroy me, to make me out as some unfit father. You've used our money, our house, our kids as bargaining chips. But it stops now." She swallowed hard, her lips trembling, but her voice stayed sharp. "You're bluffing. You don't have anything." I stepped closer. "Do you really want to test me on that? Because I'll tell you this, Marcy. You're out of time. Tony can't protect you from this. You think he's going to stick around when everything comes crashing down? When this hits a courtroom, when his name's dragged through the mud, he'll disappear, and you'll be standing there alone." She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her face turned pale, and for the first time, I saw it. Fear. Jake and Ellie deserve better than this. "They deserve better than you right now," I said softly. "But I'll fight for them. I'll fight until there's nothing left of me." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned away, staring at the floor. But I didn't stop. "This is the last time I'm saying this, Marcy. Stop. Stop whatever game you and Tony are playing, because I swear to you, I will not let you win. You'll lose the kids, the house, your reputation. Everything you care about will be gone." She turned back to me, her voice breaking. "What do you want me to do, Danny?" "Huh. What am I supposed to do now?" "End it. Call Tony. Tell him it's over. And if you ever think about pulling something like this again, I'll make sure every detail of what you've done is laid out for everyone to see." For a long moment, she just stared at me, tears staining her mascara, her shoulders trembling. Then, without another word, she walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I let out a shaky breath and sank back into the chair. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a shift, a crack in the wall Marcy had built around herself. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, my heart still racing. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Jessica again. I'd show her everything, the emails, the threats, the plans. This fight wasn't over, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, I'd face it head on. For Jake, for Ellie, for myself.